Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. There are those of us who find true peace only in hearing something terrifying in the dark. If the sound of rain helps you shut down for the night, you've found your sanctuary. Tonight's collection is designed for the lowlights and those blankets pulled up high. We're exploring encounters on abandoned backroads, the horrifying secrets buried in silent foundations, and the absolute dread of a long overnight shift. If this blend of deep horror and a calming storm helps you find your inner quiet, please remember to hit that like button right now and subscribe for more long, rainy nights. Now, let the rain wash all your worries away, and listen to the silence of the storm. Let's begin the journey. Story 1. It was past 2 in the morning when the detour sign finally broke my sleep cycle. Not a real detour, just a temporary one. A small, hand-painted wooden arrow pointing down some forgotten, muddy county road in the middle of nowhere, Ohio. I had been rolling through darkness, running hard on fumes and stale coffee for the better part of 14 hours, pushing to make a ridiculous deadline for a grocery delivery in Cincinnati. I should have stopped 3 hours earlier, but when a dispatcher gets jumpy about perishable goods, you just keep the pedal down. The rain had started sometime after midnight, a slow, drumming percussion that became my unintended lullaby, a sound I found weirdly soothing in the isolation of the cab, miles of soybean fields passing by in a constant low-light blur. At first, the sign wasn't appealing, but the main interstate it diverted off had a stretch of nasty accidents the news had warned about. The sign promised a 10-mile shortcut around the blockage. I knew better about shortcuts in the rural Midwest, but my body felt like it was dissolving into the driver's seat, and the promise of shaving off even 30 minutes seemed godsend. I checked my mirrors, flicked the turn signal, and eased the 10-ton rig off the smooth highway onto the crumbling asphalt scar officially labeled CR 224, or Creek Road as my GPS humorously labeled it before it immediately lost signal. The moment my tires connected with the secondary road, the quality of the rain changed too. It went from a lazy drum to a thick, driving, purposeful sheet, the kind that forces you to lower your brights just to keep seeing the yellow centerline, which was faded, old, and cracked, anyway. This road was dark. I mean truly dark. No streetlights for miles. The trees, old oaks and weeping willows, grew right up against the edge of the pavement, forming a perpetual tunnel that only let glimpses of the sky through. Not even the lights from the distant farmhouses managed to penetrate this canopy. It was claustrophobic, but I felt relief. At least I wasn't stuck idling on the freeway hoping to pass an accident scene. I rolled down my window an inch to let the cool, earthy smell of wet dirt and pine clear my head, the rain instantly hitting the back of my hand with a startling coldness. I was about 5 minutes down this forgotten stretch when I first saw them. They were small enough that I nearly missed them, but my high beams caught two pale, reflective surfaces moving a little too close to the edge of the road, about 100 yards up ahead. It occurred to me that I was probably looking at the reflective trim on someone's raincoat, or maybe just two deer. I immediately eased up, letting the truck start to coast. Out here, hitting a deer means not only the loss of the animal but a mountain of paperwork and the guaranteed missing of my deadline. As I got closer, I slowed to perhaps 10 miles an hour, rolling my window back up instinctively. That's when my mind finally engaged with what I was looking at. The two pale objects weren't moving. They were two figures, perhaps human, but they were definitely reflecting my light in a way that wasn't right. They were perfectly still, positioned right next to an old, splintered mailbox whose painted numbers had long since peeled away. As my truck idled gently closer, I lowered my beams, trying to get a better look, and that's when the terror started. The figures weren't tall, maybe 5 feet. They were skinny, too skinny, shaped like malnourished kids, wearing what looked like dark, heavy overcoats, the kind people in the 1950s wore. Their backs were to me, the hoods or collars of the coats pulled high against the persistent, heavy rain. Still, they did not move, seemingly immune to the noise and size of the rolling semi-truck bearing down on them. A surge of irritation, mixed with anxiety, hit me. "Move, you idiots," I whispered to the empty cab. But they didn't. No indication they had heard my air brake pressure releasing as I crept by. I laid on the horn, a loud, short blast, enough to wake the dead. Nothing. That settled it. Definitely weird, possibly suicidal folks out for a night walk. I passed them slowly, maybe 3 feet from the edge. As the cab of the truck passed them, and then the length of the trailer, I looked into the side mirror, expecting to see them jump back or turn to flip me off, furious that I had woken them out of their frozen reverie. I saw neither movement nor fury. I didn't see a back either. Instead, what reflected back into my mirror were their faces. Or where their faces should have been. The figure closest to my truck had turned its head completely as I passed, and yet, there was no definition of a nose, eyes, or mouth, just a singular, vast, white surface. No features. It was utterly blank, a featureless canvas reflecting the truck's light, and yet I knew it was looking at me. That was the moment my gut cramped into a knot of freezing terror that immediately replaced all my irritation and doubt. I slammed the gas pedal down, the big engine revving hard, and the trailer tires sliding slightly on the newly wet asphalt. I was done with CR224. Done with the shortcut. I didn't breathe until I had hit 70 miles per hour, my foot pushing the accelerator through the rusted floorboards of the cab. I checked my mirrors again. Nothing. The white, blank face of that figure was seared into my retina, and I kept driving, refusing to slow down, refusing to look back. About 10 full minutes had passed. Sweat mixed with the cold air and the chill from the rain. I finally had to ease up on the speed because this old road wasn't built for a truck doing 3-digit speeds. As I slowed, I peered ahead through the wall of rain, trying to judge where the main highway reconnected. And that's when I saw them again. 2 figures. Parked next to an old, leaning telephone pole. Positioned just like the last two. Too small, too still. Wearing the same dark, archaic clothes, hoods pulled up. But now they weren't facing the road. They were facing into the field, their backs to me. Had I driven in a circle? Impossible. The highway would have shown up on the GPS reboot attempt I had just made. My fingers were slick on the steering wheel. My heart was knocking against my ribs like an angry fist. I must be hallucinating from fatigue. That was the only logical answer. A road crew had set up dummies in rain gear, and the reflection had just fooled me in the heavy rain. I tried for a laugh, but it stuck inside my throat. This time, I didn't slow down. I held the truck steady at 55 miles per hour and drove directly at the figures, laying on the horn blast continuously, hoping they would scatter or move or just not be there. As I passed the pole, I kept my eyes locked on the side mirror, expecting the same blank, terrifying face. I saw the backs of their heads again, completely motionless. But this time things changed. As the long trailer passed the figures, both smaller forms turned very sharply and simultaneously towards the passing vehicle, not swiveling with the motion, but sharply turning their necks at impossible angles. And then I heard it. Clear through the thick, waterproof layer of the truck's windshield and the torrential deluge of sound from the storm, I heard what sounded like faint, repetitive knocking. Not on the window. Not on the body of the truck. It sounded like they were tapping on the rear axle housing or the storage compartments beneath the trailer. A series of short, quick, rhythmic raps. As quickly as I heard it, I lost it in the thrum of the engine and the thunder of the storm. I checked the rearview again, just getting glimpses of their receding forms in the mirror's distortion, still standing by themselves. Still looking at me. I drove another 5 miles, my breath ragged. I just had to get to the main road. The knocking sound was replaced by the pounding of rain, but the image of those 2 small, pale-faced figures was the only thing I could see. I pressed the accelerator harder, the cab vibrating with power. I was near the end. I could feel it, where the pavement changed quality and met back up with civilization or the highway. Then, the brake lights went on. Ahead. Not mine. His. The truck was a beat-up Ford pickup, painted rust color, parked right in my lane, effectively blocking the road. A single occupant. A man in a baseball cap was struggling under the downpour. pointing a large, multi-cell flashlight at the hood of his truck like he was trying to inspect it. He looked like he was having significant engine trouble. Just what I needed. Not only was the road blocked, but the man had clearly seen me coming too fast out of the long darkness. I pulled my air brakes hard, the semi-trailer groaning as I slid to a stop, perhaps 20 feet from the back of the dilapidated Ford. I instinctively reached for the CB radio mic, intending to offer a quick lift to the next town or call a tow for him, feeling bad that the guy was broken down out here in the storm. I watched the man through my dripping windshield. He was shaking the flashlight angrily, and then he stopped. He stopped struggling with the hood. He just froze, his head lifted, slowly turning to look at my truck. His baseball cap was instantly soaked in the relentless rain. His movement was wrong. Too careful. Too calculated. And then I noticed the familiar clothes. Those same high, dark collars. The same dark, heavy, outdated rain gear. He was too tall for the figures I had passed, but something about his posture, how he froze, how his eyes weren't meeting mine but were fixed on the bottom of my truck, made my stomach drop with pure glacial clarity. This wasn't a person. This was the entity, or one of them, just taller this time. He took one step away from his truck, towards my large grill, and tilted his head just like the smaller one I had passed half an hour ago. The movements were those of an animatronic attempting a human impression. The fear I felt was crippling. His hand was reaching out, slowly, towards the front bumper of my cab. Not a friendly wave. An inspection. A final touch. And from behind my semi-trailer, from the darkness I had just escaped, I heard them again. The knocking. But this time it wasn't distant or faint. It was right behind me. A series of rap, rap, on the steel of my truck's rear deck plate, followed by a faint, wet scrapee as something began struggling to climb aboard. And the man in the dark coat started moving fast. Not running, but sculling to get to my cab door. I didn't think. I just put the rig in reverse, slamming the gas pedal sideways toward the darkness with the hope that backing up would shake whatever was climbing off the back. I felt the trailer lurch, heard a tremendous clank. From the rear axle, the metallic sound of something heavy being jarred hard and falling to the road. The man on the hood turned his head a quarter rotation, a movement no human neck could manage, and he simply vanished, dissolving into the rain as I tore backward, tires throwing gouts of water and mud against the trees. I backed up fast, my eyes alternating between my rearview mirror and the side view, not looking to see if he was chasing me, but desperate to see where the road ended. Finally, a small, gravel side road, almost overgrown, appeared to my left. Before I could make sense of it, I swung the wheel hard, taking the turn so tight that my trailer tires jumped the small bank and slid into a low ditch, the cab hitting the mud hard. I slammed it into drive and kept the gas down, the powerful semi-engine screaming as it desperately clawed its way out of the ditch and onto the slightly more elevated gravel. This time, I didn't stop until I saw pavement of the main highway. I found it, finally, the smooth, welcoming asphalt a sight for sore eyes. I merged onto the interstate and pushed the truck to a safe 75 miles per hour, my hands sweating, shaking uncontrollably, heart slamming against my ribs. I kept going for another 2 hours without stopping, only pulling over at a well-lit, busy truck stop outside of Columbus. I sat there in the silence, listening to the light remnants of the rain, staring wide-eyed at the cup holder. I still hadn't found the courage to get out of the cab. When I finally eased out to check the whole truck in the morning light, there were no dents, no telltale shadows, just a thick layer of grit and road mud from CR 224 clinging to the side. The only thing I found odd was on the metal plate just above the axle, on the back of the trailer. Embedded in the caked-on mud were two single, small, hand-like prints where the mud was scraped away, revealing clean, unoxidized chrome beneath. These prints were far too small to be from a man, but the way they were spaced, and the depth of the scrape, exactly as if something small but heavy had clung to the bottom of my truck for miles that dark, terrible night. I wiped them away, finished my route, and I quit that job a week later. Now, whenever the rain starts, the sound is no longer soothing. All I hear is that faint, but persistent, rapping sound, wondering where the next group of blank, dark figures will be waiting for me to take the shortcut. Story 2. Working night security for a massive, multi-level retail warehouse near the 405 in Carson, outside of LA, felt more like babysitting a tomb than actually protecting assets. The facility was cold, echoing, and packed wall-to-wall with consumer-grade electronics that only mattered to the insurance company. My actual job was performed entirely from a small, climate-controlled booth where a massive wall of 32 camera feeds glowed a sickly, monochromatic green. The only thing I fought was chronic, sleep-inducing boredom, which the incessant, thin drizzle of the Southern California winter rain only amplified. Our security system was archaic, barely updated since the late 90s. Low-resolution cameras and sensors on the doors, all set to an endless digital loop. The shift was simple: monitor the screens, log the periodic errors, and survive the 8 hours of solitude until the cleaning crew arrived. The problem with being a night security guard that relies solely on monitors is that your eyes, the most complex and trustworthy tools you have, begin to betray you due to fatigue. You start seeing things move when they shouldn't. Small, fast-passing shadows in the absolute dead stillness of the 3 a.m. warehouse floor are usually nothing more than dust motes floating past the static lens filter. But this one was different. This one I saw clearly. It was 2:45 a.m., and I was scrolling through the feed that covered aisle 14, the deep aisle for heavy machinery and metal storage pallets. The camera caught a shadow. Not a dust spot, but an actual, three-dimensional disruption of light. It was tall, thin, and the color of pure, wet soot. It passed from the center of aisle 14 all the way to the far wall with an unnerving, deliberate slowness. I immediately stopped the camera auto-scroll, isolated the feed, and watched the frozen moment again. Its speed, it moved far too slowly for a dust mote, but far too quickly for a human intruder to pass the lens. I hit the intercom button, a loud, piercing buzzer connected to speakers scattered over the warehouse complex. Security check in aisle 14. Identify yourself immediately. My voice was amplified and re-amplified by the echoing ceiling, shattering the otherwise peaceful silence inside the tomb-like structure. There was no reply. I didn't waste any time calling the local police. I grabbed my powerful industrial flashlight, unsnapped the holster from my legal carry taser, and headed out of the cold booth into the colder hallway. My internal compass was spun, and my adrenaline was already high. Real shadow, real physical presence. It defied the logic of a sealed interior space. It took me 4 minutes to walk the desolate length of the 2 football field long main aisles to reach my target. When I arrived, the high steel racks of aisle 14 stretched out into a confusing perspective of boxes, pallets, and deep, dark shadows, pierced only by the sharp, intense beam of my flashlight. The aisle was cold, colder than the rest of the warehouse, feeling dry even as I heard the persistent, drumming drizzle of the rain outside beating on the corrugated metal roof. I swept my beam along the wall where the object had disappeared, checking for footprints, discarded packaging, any sign of an intruder. Nothing. The floor was perfect, sterile gray cement. Then, the second event occurred. As I scanned for a point of disturbance on the far corner, a quiet but unmistakable tap came from the racks immediately behind my head, exactly where the camera feed had been fixed. It was a single, gentle, but definite impact sound, like an elongated fingertip making contact with a small, metal box. I immediately threw my headlamp focus and the heavy flashlight beam at the shelf stacked 10 feet up behind me. Nothing. Just static, silent, heavy boxes. The feeling of utter exposure, of being caught with my back turned, was crippling. I started to shake the flashlight beam frantically over the entire area, ready to use my taser or call for a full police lockdown. Instead of retreating, I took 2 tentative steps forward, determined to break the paralysis and find a plausible explanation. It happened again. As if in synchronized response to my forward movement, the entity reappeared on the monitor feed I was no longer watching. I suddenly knew this, a cold, absolute certainty in my gut. My eyes desperately darted from the physical aisle in front of me to the small pocket camera I had left clipped on my chest, filming the encounter. It wasn't on the external camera wall, but on my small chest-mounted lens. A fast, dark shape skimmed the corner of a nearby metal storage unit and vanished again. I snatched the camera off my chest and played back the short 5-second clip, trying to watch it on the tiny viewfinder under the weak light of my beam. The shadowy figure was there, not soot, not dust, but a fully formed human silhouette, taller and thinner at the extremities than any man should be. It was moving too smoothly, without the natural jarring that accompanies human locomotion. And it was moving to the right, toward the deepest shadows of the next row of stock. I realized with terrifying clarity that the entity never remained in the same place as the live camera feed because it had a profound, instantaneous knowledge of where my full attention was focused. My full field of vision was its absence. I had brought the small clip-on camera out here, and it was now moving toward that lens, towards me, using the light of my vision as its guide. A surge of panic made me retreat, walking backwards slowly, keeping my heavy flashlight locked on the distant wall. The entity didn't need to chase me, it just needed to wait until I turned my back to leave. As I retreated toward the main hallway, a heavy, 20-kilogram paper box on the top shelf of the furthest rack in aisle 14 suddenly began to scrape silently. Then, the scraping sound was replaced by an impossibly clean, final slide, and the large box plunged off its shelf in a heavy, dizzying drop. It missed me by only 2 feet, smashing onto the sterile cement floor with a massive crush and spray of compressed consumer product, the sound deafening even in the immense volume of the warehouse. I didn't stop to survey the damage or to call it in. I simply broke into an unrestrained, wide-open sprint for my control booth. I made it back in 60 seconds, slamming the emergency locking key on the thick steel door behind me. I sat back down in the swivel chair, my breath heavy and cold in the heat of the small booth. I pulled up aisle 14's external monitor feed. It was silent. Still. Perfectly ordinary, only a massive pile of compressed cardboard scrap on the far-off cement floor indicating the physical reality of my terror. I was safe now, sealed behind multi-lock steel. My gaze was fixed on the screen, scanning every inch of detail where the shadow might still reappear. That's when I noticed it for the final, most terrifying moment of the shift. The camera feed that covered the entrance to my control booth, camera 32, a fixed fisheye view of the door I had just locked, began recording a strange anomaly I had never noticed before. The feed was running perfectly, yet, in the very center of the lens, directly at the apex of the curve of the glass, a tiny, localized distortion started to appear. It was clearly recognizable, a miniature, three-dimensional, deeply unsettling shadow. The shade was very small, the size of a man's thumbnail, perfectly and unnervingly still, with no visible means of support or physical attachment, staring through the distortion, right at the center of the camera. The shadow then began to increase its size, a very, very slow, controlled process, almost as if it was crawling forward through my lens. The physical sensation was that of an absolute, heavy cold focused directly on my eyes. The only way I survived the next 4 hours until the day cleaning crew arrived was by shutting my eyes and not looking again at the camera wall. I never took an overnight shift in surveillance again. That shadowy creature in the warehouse didn't need bodies or movement in the physical world. It only needed to use the cameras, the single point of visual focus, as its silent window. You can protect your body with cameras, but what entity only moves by observation, only shows itself through the lens of a machine? I never turn down a mirror now without checking the static. What shadow it casts in the dim, drizzling light, always remembering the horrifying lesson: you can't catch a shadow that lives where your eyes are focused. Story 3. The old house was built without the owner understanding the point of basements. They had dug perhaps 7 feet down, just enough to get past the frost line of the soil, poured a foundation, and stopped right there. This gave us about 4 feet of usable underground space, which my younger brother, Dale, immediately claimed as an apartment when our family moved to a small town in rural Indiana when I was 16. It was less an apartment and more a shallow, damp, semi-finished bunker for a 17-year-old high school kid who hated his parents. Our small, ordinary American house, split level, 3 beds, 2 baths, quickly had a strange, separate identity when it came to Dale. He'd sleep, eat, and breathe down there, only coming up for a stale hamburger patty or a mandatory Sunday dinner. I didn't question it. We were brothers, 2 years apart, and that meant we were permanently dedicated to ignoring each other. But in the spring of '96, the basement started changing my brother, or maybe something down below started wearing my brother as a temporary skin suit. It began subtly, like all the worst terrors do. Dale started losing weight. Not like a teenager naturally thins out, it was gaunt. His cheekbones jutted out from his face in a way they never had before, and his eyes, brown and intense, retreated into deep, charcoal rings from what I assumed was his chronic lack of sleep, likely due to terrible gaming habits. He started spending 36-hour stretches down there without coming up for food, and when I, out of morbid fraternal curiosity, once asked him to come up for a movie night, he refused with a strained, rattling cough that sounded too harsh for someone his age. The other thing was the language. Dale majored in minimum effort, not linguistics. But he started mumbling when he slept now, audible through the cheap HVAC vent that shared the main floor bedroom to his cellar space. It began with unintelligible whispers, usually a soft clicking or scraping noise, then slowly transitioned into recognizable cadence, but not recognizable words. It sounded like an awful, guttural form of Latin, maybe, a series of hard G's and rolling R's separated by sharp, barking expirations. When our mom finally heard it one Tuesday morning, loud enough from her spot at the kitchen table, she just nervously called it stressful puberty and loud music causing auditory confusion, which was the family's main way of handling a crisis. Dad, a retired Marine who only communicated in commands, just told Dale to take some aspirin and to stop bothering his mother. And Dale listened, but only in the most terrifying way. Dale finally stopped talking. His appearances became unsettling. When he came up for those required Sunday dinners, he had no presence. He walked right past us without acknowledging anyone, stood at the kitchen counter staring at the wood grain for 10 minutes, then helped himself to an alarming amount of red meat and bread, and took it back down to his bunker, slamming the low basement door with an authority he surely hadn't owned 3 months prior. His hands were shaking all the time, a rapid, low-amplitude tremor that he didn't even notice. And when he spoke back to my dad, an event which had rarely failed to create a 10-hour shouting match with heavy sanctions, he didn't sound like Dale. Dad once asked him to change his oil for the old Ford sedan, a standard chore. Dale responded with a low, smooth voice, completely devoid of teenage irritation and angst, saying in an echoingly placid tone, "We are considering your imposition upon our schedule." My dad just stopped slicing the chicken and stared into the air, as still and white as the snow outside. He never asked Dale to do a chore again. But it got worse. The things coming from the basement tenant, as I started to subconsciously call it, began to mimic my father. My father had a distinct, deep, basso-speaking style, a way of enunciating that projected authority and a residual military toughness. My dad, in his mid-50s at the time, also suffered from a lifelong smoking habit that made his true voice slightly more ragged when he was tired. One night, around 2 in the morning, which was my prime slot for video games, I swore I heard my dad moving around downstairs, walking his specific, heavy gait on the wood floor. He was speaking, too, talking about the furnace suddenly breaking. I was already too tired for this. I grabbed an old blanket and padded to the top of the stairs, ready to tell him I'd look at the furnace in the morning. When I reached the small, dark landing, bathed only in the distant street light glow through the window, I heard the voice clearly coming from the bottom of the basement stairs right below me. It was Dad's voice, too clear, a perfect copy of his tone and bass. The only thing wrong was one crucial detail. It was my dad's voice before the smoking had taken hold. It was the smooth, strong, unwavering command of a 40-year-old Marine captain, but talking with a dry, cracked, unnatural repetition. "We need to acquire the heat for her lord." Pause. "Heat. Lord! Below! I froze instantly. My real father was easily audible snoring, loudly but rhythmically, from the master bedroom directly down the hall. I stood absolutely still, my knuckles white on the flimsy wooden banister. The low, imitation father voice repeated the sentence again, this time adding a bizarre, wet chirping sound at the end, as if the imitation was straining at the boundary of what could be imitated. It went quiet. Then came the sound that solidified everything inside my 18-year-old brain, the rattling, metallic sound of the shallow basement door opening, slowly, creak by agonizing creak. Whatever was down there, whatever had been talking to itself, learning to speak in broken Latin, and then adapting the tone of my marine father, was now coming up, leaving the confines of the basement tenant for the quiet, dark space of the main house. I stumbled back, not running, but crawling backward along the carpet, desperately trying not to make a noise that would indicate my presence at the top of the stairs. As I reached the doorway to my room, I saw it. The hallway was empty. The sound of the lock and bolt on my door was louder than everything else, louder than the rain and the silence of the rest of the house. I sat against the door, holding my breath, staring at the weak light filtering in from the window. Minutes bled away. I heard a noise that sounded like a very fine, dry scratching, an insect perhaps, which quickly grew into a sound more unsettling than the walking I had avoided. It was quiet, repetitive, metallic tapping. Ping, ping, ping. Then, the sound was right outside my door, in the hall. It sounded like fingernails tapping, not on the wood, but on the metal strike plate of the door frame itself. And then the voice began again. My dad's pre-smoking voice. Only this time, it was distorted, slowed down. Syllables stretched into echoing horror and punctuated by heavy, wet swapping sounds of breath. Swapping sound. Are you hiding, son? Swapping sound. Your brother has been a good tenant. Swapping sound. The terrifying thing was the attempt at empathy or parental concern, a grotesque effort to convince me. The wet swapping, the sound of thick mucus or something even worse moving inside the vocal cords, confirmed my suspicions about the entity's unhuman nature. I stayed silent, frozen in the corner of my room, completely still until the sun broke the horizon, ignoring the cold sweat that I was drenched in. When the early autumn sun finally peeked through the window pane, bringing with it a sliver of normalcy and light, the tapping stopped. The shuffling, wet sounds in the hallway stopped. When I finally found the courage to open the door, hours later, the hall was completely empty, silent, and smelling faintly of ozone and something like crushed mothballs. I looked down the small stairwell to the basement. Dale's door was shut, securely bolted. I listened. Nothing. Just an ordinary, quiet house on a Tuesday morning. I went to the kitchen. My real father was at the table, loudly coughing, reading the finance section of the newspaper, a huge thermos of black coffee sitting next to him. Dad never once mentioned the voice I had heard. Dale finally emerged for breakfast, hours later. He looked just as malnourished as he had the other times. As he reached past me for the toaster, a sudden movement made me look down. His right forearm. Just below the short sleeve of his shirt, there was a raised mark on the skin that looked strangely like dried ink or a brand. I didn't know what I was looking at. Maybe a small burn. But the image was clear enough to send a knife-sharp chill down my spine. The mark was a perfect circle, about the size of a quarter. Embedded in its center, a swirling, complex set of lines, barely visible, but strikingly precise. I reached out instinctively to rub the skin. He flinched away from my touch. His eyes, once soft brown, were now pitch black and intense. His pupils were not small. They were unnaturally large, like black holes swallowing his original color entirely. Then, his face did something worse than stare blankly at me, a rapid, grotesque mimicry of a friendly smile, a series of complex muscles flexing and rippling, ending in a perfectly straight, uncanny line. I froze in place. Years later, Dale had fully recovered. He was healthy, finished college, and took a job at an IT firm in Silicon Valley. He never mentioned the basement tenant to me, but I didn't need him to. The truth wasn't in his words, but in the silence. Because every time my real father had a severe coughing fit, the kind that racked his body, Dale would stop what he was doing, wherever he was, and look directly at me with that unnatural, black-eyed intensity, a silent challenge in the void of his pupils. I finally understood it all. The possession hadn't been thrown out, it had only been temporarily housed, borrowing the voice, learning the man, and waiting for its moment to claim him in full. The basement tenant wasn't a temporary resident. He had paid us a long, terrible visit, and I knew for certain that sooner or later, as the decades passed, that imitation of my father's voice would become perfect, and I would be left wondering who was sitting at the breakfast table. Story 4. I've always loved the woods of Yosemite. The smell of lodgepole pine, the high granite peaks, the sheer, unapologetic scale of it all. It's a cathedral of nature. A few years back, I'd gone out with 2 college friends, Jeremy and Mike, on a fairly aggressive 5-day hike deep into the backcountry, far north of the main trails everyone takes. We weren't wilderness experts, but we were competent, well-supplied, and had a decent map. We were aiming for an obscure, alpine lake known only to the diehard types. Things went wrong on the second day, but not in the way you'd imagine. Not a bear, not a twisted ankle, or a rapid change in weather. It was a failure of the world's physics, a momentary but sustained slip out of the natural order that left an existential burn scar on my sense of reality. The issue was, quite simply, space. We got lost around midday after a slightly aggressive scramble over a set of granite boulders near an unnamed creek. Jeremy, who had the map and the most reliable sense of direction, insisted we were due north of the boulder field and needed to head east for 30 degrees to intersect the marked trail. I thought we were more to the southeast. Mike, unsurprisingly, was no help and just wanted to take a 5-minute break. A normal navigational dispute in the wilderness is quickly resolved by compass or sun position, but once we restarted and walked for another strenuous 15 minutes, moving over a shallow slope, we broke out into what should have been a thick pine forest, but instead was a nearly perfect, 300-foot diameter grassy meadow. And the instant Mike broke the tree line, he stopped dead in his tracks. "Wait," he said, holding up a cautious hand. "Didn't we just come from there?" We looked around. The meadow was bordered by thick, nearly identical-looking forest on 3 sides, with the creek, the same unnamed one, I was certain, snaking rapidly away on the 4th. In the center of the clearing sat a single, massive boulder, split cleanly in half with a dark, vertical fault line running through it. Jeremy immediately grew agitated. He recognized the meadow, too, and definitely recognized the signature split boulder. We'd eaten lunch 2 hours prior, sitting in the shadow of that exact crevice, resting 30 minutes after our morning hike uphill. We hadn't been in a straight line, but we certainly hadn't circled back, either, having climbed steadily over the ridge we were disputing the coordinates of. There was no point of reference to confirm it was the same meadow aside from our memory, but the split rock felt too particular, too unique to ignore. We checked the compass. It pointed decidedly north, and the shadows dictated late afternoon, consistent with hours of sustained hiking. The physics was wrong. The geography was an absolute lie. We had, impossibly, walked in a vast, wide circle, uphill, over dense terrain, and wound up right back where we had lunched. We were deeply unsettled, but the sun was fading, meaning we had to move past it. We chose a clear vector, noted which side of the rock we started from, and started marching, determined not to stop until we had covered serious ground. We marched for a full hour and a half, not fast, but persistent and consistent across the uneven forest floor. We were tired, slightly unnerved, but we kept pushing through the dense, repetitive mountain woods. And then, we broke out into another clearing. Same size. Same rapid creek. My heart actually sank in my chest. The same split boulder. We had walked in a straight line for 90 minutes, and were back at the starting point. When it happened the 3rd time, 2 hours later, we didn't wait for morning. We didn't even argue. We just swore, dropped our packs, and realized we were caught. The realization wasn't just that we were lost. It was the comprehension that this part of the world, this vast, beautiful, well-mapped national park was cheating us. Someone, or something, was pulling at the very map of reality just for this quadrant of the forest. We were in an illogical, physically contradictory time loop of space. Darkness had fallen, a dense, consuming mountain darkness that even the stars couldn't pierce. We were all three huddled up inside our expensive, 0-degree rated sleeping bags, trying to mentally calculate how much food we had left. A wave of profound despair washed over us, the kind you only get when you accept that your reliance on logic has become irrelevant. The rain started just as Jeremy was whispering about the need for immediate, professional rescue, a thin, miserable drizzle that wasn't even strong enough to drown out the night noises. The forest around us was loud, not with animals, but with the sound of snapping twigs, quiet brush passing against material, and unmistakably and horribly, a faint, guttural, dragging sound slightly less heavy than the noise I'd heard inside the New England house. My anxiety spiked. I reached out for my phone. Hopeless, still no signal after 3 days. But then I remembered I had managed to pick up one full bar of low-range FM radio signal on a classic handheld model I used for weather and time alerts. I pulled it out, flicked the power on, and hit the scan button. Static rushed in, and then unexpectedly, a low voice, male, somewhat familiar, immediately cut through the white noise. It was a slow, slightly elongated drawl, the kind a person uses when they are speaking to themselves or trying to get the pronunciation of common words exactly correct. And it was speaking my name repeatedly. Will, listen to yourself. Will. My terror was instantly replaced by a deep and heavy adrenaline-soaked confusion. With frantic fingers, I cranked the volume dial. The voice intensified, moving from the speaker in a strained, painful-sounding rush. The voice wasn't narrating my story or telling me what to do. It was giving an account of a hike, of 3 people losing their minds over a repeating meadow. It was me. It was my voice, recounting my fear, detailing the lack of orientation, complaining about Jeremy's bad navigation, talking about the split boulder. The vocal projection was slightly more rushed than my natural speaking pattern, riddled with a kind of hysterical anxiety and a low background groaning noise. But the specific cadence, the phrasing, and the pitch, it was an exact, undeniable facsimile of my own terrified internal monologue being broadcast over an empty FM frequency. I started shaking my head, a desperate attempt to dislodge the sound from my reality. This was a sophisticated prank, perhaps a hidden low-power transmitter Jeremy or Mike had brought. I searched for a way to stop it, to turn it off, staring wild-eyed into the pitch black of the tent. The clock is wrong, Will. Will, the radio version of my own voice said. You should never have taken the radio on the 5th day. The 5th day. My blood turned to ice. Today was only the 2nd day. Had I, the version of me in the box, already lived past today? I had only a moment to think of the temporal horror of what I was holding. Then the recording ended. Abruptly. Not with a cutout, not with white noise, but with a sharp, deep sound of a thick, clamping noise, like a jaw snapping shut, a wet, final tchak, of something large closing on something small. Then silence. Only the sound of the rain, the sound of the quiet breathing of anxiety next to me. Jeremy had been asleep. Mike was awake, crying silently into his shoulder, face hidden from me. He said he hadn't heard anything except the final tchak sound over the radio. But he said that noise was enough. We left early in the drizzle of the morning, not even bothering to pack. We just put on our hiking boots, grabbed the packs they were in, and walked a desperate, single vector. The logical way out. We passed the same meadow, the same split boulder, for the 4th time that morning within 2 hours of walking. We didn't stop. We didn't talk. We ignored the profound irony and just pushed, refusing to look left or right, driven solely by the irrational, non-navigational terror instilled by the radio. We made it out by the 7th hour, exhausted, scratched, and mentally shattered, but functional. We stopped at the first small, roadside diner we saw, drinking 7 coffees each, talking over each other's words to keep the terror at bay. I tried to explain the audio. The terror of hearing my own voice narrate a moment that hadn't happened yet. They didn't know what to believe. To this day, I can't shake the image of 4 days of my life being lived out elsewhere, recorded, and broadcast back to me, only to end with an unavoidable, fatal clamping sound. I never finished that memory. I don't know what happened to future me in the tent in 5 days in the woods. But every time I touch a radio dial, I feel the same clammy, immediate panic, a chilling reminder that, somewhere out there in the high country of the Yosemite Peaks, the version of me stuck on a 2-day-long spatial loop only had 4 days remaining, and that I was somehow warned of his fate by his own terrified voice, leaving me in a different, but infinitely more terrifying prison of unknown, permanent safety. Story 5. If there's one place in America the rain makes truly awful, it's the Louisiana Bayou. The water doesn't simply fall, it collects, forming vast, black, reflecting swamps that swallow the silence and then amplify every sound into a suffocating echo. My younger brother, Chris, and I grew up near New Orleans, fascinated by the thick folklore of Cajun country, the stories of treaders, and the dark whispers of voodoo. Our obsession led us to a disastrous experiment, proving the existence of the legendary Arcara swamp graves, an unmarked, decades-old indigenous burial site deep in the heart of the Atchafalaya Basin, protected by the ghost of a tribal priestess. Our scientific goal was to install trail cameras and capture irrefutable proof of paranormal activity. Our actual goal was to get an adrenaline rush and a story. The latter, unfortunately, we accomplished with horrifying clarity. We went in on a Friday night, the sky already bruised charcoal and spitting rain, the kind of weather that forces the air pressure down to unbearable levels. We launched our flat-bottom skiff into the water near a forgotten spillway and navigated for 2 hours across the thick, waterlogged maze of mud and cypress knees to reach the small, water-surrounded isle that, according to local maps, sat directly atop the rumored site. The dense, choking fog rolling off the water was immediate and persistent, trapping us visually only 2 feet out from the boat. We secured the skiff to a half-submerged cypress tree, and I carried the first specialized trail camera, an infrared, passive infrared PIR, motion model, while Chris carried the equipment to elevate and camouflage it. The first camera went up in relative silence, anchored high up on an ancient cypress 100 yards from the bank, overlooking the dense mud and weed-encrusted center of the island where the unmarked graves were supposedly located. The tension was immediate. Even with the persistent, noisy splash of rain on the oily water, an unnerving silence lingered under everything else, an absence of frogs, crickets, or life of any kind. As we set the second camera, anchored to a fallen hardwood log 40 feet from the first, Chris stopped and immediately grabbed my arm, his entire body suddenly rigid. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice thin and sharp with fear. I listened hard. Nothing. Only the quiet, rhythmic pulse of the heavy southern rain and the low thrum of the fog-bound water. "It was singing, Matt!" A voice. Too low. He released my arm quickly and moved faster, driven by an urgency I recognized as pure fear. We didn't exchange any more words. We finished securing the third camera, a sensitive time-lapse photography unit, to a thick knot of vegetation with a perfect view of the entire central site, and immediately retreated, racing away as the now torrential rain swallowed our return path whole. The next day, we managed to get a full recovery signal set up 50 yards from the main waterway, still far enough away to avoid disturbing the site further. We had installed a complex radio frequency remote retrieval system that could beam the internal video storage from the memory cards directly to our laptop screen inside the safety of the skiff. We had recorded exactly 6 hours of data, most of it being ambient shots of fog, rain, and empty, stagnant water. We were about to call it a failed experiment until Chris let out a single, sharp yell of complete terror, causing me to jump, spilling my lukewarm coffee right on the sensitive keyboard. The third time-lapse camera, the one with the best, most centered view of the site, suddenly woke up and started transmitting a clear, distinct video feed. The fog had completely lifted, and the image was crisp. What showed was beyond anything logical or comforting. In a clearing, precisely located in the middle of a tight, dense circle of cypress, there was a single, 3-foot-tall mound of churned-up earth, clearly revealing the ancient, waterlogged top of a large pine coffin, a burial mound we hadn't noticed the night before. Immediately in front of this exposed coffin, silhouetted against the weak, early morning light, stood a figure. A woman. Tall. Unnervingly thin, wearing a long, simple, black shapeless dress, the kind of clothing women from the region wore a full century ago, and on her head, a traditional, deep black priestess's wrap. The woman was absolutely still. But her hand, her long, pale, slender arm, was doing something terrifying. It was repeatedly, slowly, touching the cold, wet lens of the camera with the entire surface of an open palm, seemingly stroking the surface, or measuring the light it emitted. It stayed that way, only the slow, rhythmic movement of the fingers disturbing the stagnant air, until another movement from a different camera broke the spell. The closest camera, Camera 1, about 30 feet from the figure, had triggered an EMF exposure alarm and was starting to transmit its data, a slow, frame-by-frame progression of a sudden event. In the first few frames, the footage showed nothing. But then, as the motion stabilization system struggled, frames 5 and 6 showed a new shape, a thin black, highly defined human shadow streaking across the foreground of the lens. This shadow wasn't a projection. It was a pure, organized blot of solid black that absorbed all light and texture, moving so fast that our human eyes struggled to resolve its shape. This shadow had been triggered by the movement, not of us approaching it, but of the sudden, aggressive act of the woman touching the camera. With terrifying speed, the shadow caught up to the woman. There was no struggle, no sound, even when we turned the volume up all the way. The shadow simply reached the back of the woman and merged with her, a horrifying, visual effect that looked like ink suddenly exploding on dry powder. Once merged, the woman's form immediately stopped moving and completely froze in the video, standing only inches from the exposed burial mound. The only remaining detail, her head was turned, with a final, deliberate movement, until she was looking directly at the angle where our skiff would have been docked the night before, a massive, unsmiling, clear expression of absolute, unassailable vigilance on her face. Chris frantically hit the stop button on the recorder, cutting the live feed permanently, severing the link abruptly out of a sheer, overpowering sense of terror and exposure. That was the last image we ever saw from the Bayou burial site. The cameras are still there, anchored to the mud, filming an empty, rain-filled swamp where a long-dead, deeply possessive entity continually stands guard. We only went back to retrieve the skiff early on Monday morning, never taking a single step on the bank of that small island ever again. We didn't bother checking the final state of the cameras. We knew that the only thing contained in the last 2 minutes of their recorded lifetime was the exact, final, clear and focused image of her terrifying, silent face. The curse wasn't on the unholy act of taking the camera footage. It was on the living, breathing human observer who had dared to view her ancient, sacred work in the dark. Story 6. Nevada. It's a cruel state to suffer a breakdown in, especially after midnight, and especially when the sky finally decides to give up its reserve and hammer down a torrential rainstorm. I was driving hard from Reno to an assignment in Salt Lake City, running late, my beat-up Ford sedan barely hanging on to the high G wind buffeting it from the vast, open blackness of the high desert plains and mountains. It was nearly 1 a.m., and I was on State Route 50, known to the locals as the loneliest road in America. You could drive for half an hour without seeing a single taillight, and that night, every mile was an existential exercise in isolation. When I saw the figure, I slammed my foot on the brake not because I wanted to pick him up, but just out of pure, deep-seated reflex and surprise. He stood right on the edge of the asphalt, a silhouette in a hooded black poncho, holding a small cardboard sign covered in plastic film that simply said East. He was drenched, shivering in the massive rain, and looked completely spent. No bags, no visible backpack, not even a reflective trim on his clothing. Just a man. I had promised myself 100 times that I wouldn't pick up anyone out here, but something about the sheer desolation of the spot where he was standing broke my resolve. My conscience, mixed with the intense cold of a Nevada winter at that altitude, got the better of me. I slowed down, pulled the Ford onto the narrow, gravel shoulder, and waited for him to get in. He moved quickly, almost too quickly. Before I had even fully pulled the parking brake, he was fumbling with the passenger door's ancient mechanism. He slid in, slamming the old door with a definitive thud that cracked the tense silence I had cultivated. He was a young man, maybe 25 or 26, though the terrible shadows thrown by the limited street light made him look ancient. He didn't offer a name, a reason, or even a thanks. He just sat there, staring straight ahead at my wipers doing their futile, frantic dance against the wall of water outside the windshield. The moment he was inside, the intense, high-country chill I'd been fighting against suddenly intensified tenfold in the cab, the car's heater doing nothing to penetrate the dry cold radiating from his wet clothes. Rough night for a walk, I managed, trying to break the tension, keeping my eyes fixed on the asphalt ahead, trying to ease the car back onto the highway safely. He immediately replied, but he didn't address my question. His voice was a flat, deep, entirely expressionless monotone, utterly devoid of the warmth or fear you'd expect from a freezing man who had just been saved from the desert cold. "It's 78426311186. He droned on and on, repeating sequences of low digits that had no meaning for me, his accent perfectly clear, slightly East Coast American, but the context was utterly alien. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe he was a tired tech worker dealing with code. "Where you headed, buddy? I'll drop you at the next town, save you the rest of this awful drive." He didn't acknowledge the question or the laugh. He just continued his long, low sequence, slightly increasing the pitch of his voice. 16.5 miles, latitude, 4517-4, he muttered. I looked at my passenger. Even with the internal lights off, I could see an unnerving detail through the dim instrument panel glow. His clothes were soaked, yes, but not in rain. His black nylon poncho and his thick, woolen sweater seemed to be clinging to him with a kind of wet soot. It was thick, matte, and smelled faintly metallic, a bit like burnt copper mixed with very old, dried-out seawater, the kind of stale air pumped out by old coastal factories. Despite that terrible wetness and cold, he was not visibly shivering. He was unnervingly still. I slowly eased my speed back down, starting to look for the first well-lit parking lot to pull into, a gas station, a hotel, anything to get this silently terrifying individual out of my warm, safe car. "Hey, man. Look, is everything okay with you? Do you need a hospital?" I asked, trying hard to use a friendly, non-threatening tone. He simply turned his featureless face directly towards me, his eyes two dark spots in the heavy shadow cast by the cowl. He started talking again, but this time his speech was a sudden, rapid, high-intensity burst of a different content completely. Not numbers. Not coordinates. It was a bizarre, internal self-assessment. "I don't know. I'm cold. I shouldn't be here. The light is terrible. The metal is hot. It's still hot." The words were frantic. The voice had completely changed. It was higher, strained, and filled with deep, palpable terror, the voice of a complete panic attack. He was screaming, but with no outward amplification of sound, a perfect inner shriek that I was receiving directly into my skull. Panic finally set my actions into motion. I slammed the brake pedal hard enough to activate the ABS, sending the car into a nasty, vibrating slide on the wet, slick pavement. The sudden movement had the desired effect. It broke the hypnotic terror that had settled over the cab. The man, the figure, was instantly jostled hard against the passenger door, and he let out a short, sudden, dry, gasping noise. I turned to look at him, my heart slamming a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, ready to simply abandon the car and run out into the heavy rain. And the passenger seat was empty. Completely empty. The only sign that anyone had been there was a slight indentation on the faded velvet seat where the weight of a man had pressed down. No footprints, no muddy tracks on the floor mat, no residual dampness on the glass from the thick rain that had covered the poncho. just the profound, glacial cold still hanging like a curtain over the entire passenger side of my car, and a sudden, intense smell of pure, heavy ozone, the sharp, unmistakable smell of recently superheated metal burning violently. My throat tightened. The smell rapidly faded, leaving only the stale scent of old vinyl and cold metal. As I gripped the wheel hard, breathing fast, trying to reconcile the absolute emptiness with the absolute fullness of the encounter, I noticed a tiny, subtle light on my dashboard. The check engine light had instantly turned on. But the light wasn't red or yellow. It was a flickering, sickly blue. I pulled back onto the highway, hitting 85 miles per hour instantly, forcing my frantic fear into the engine, driving hard for the next hour until I hit the extreme glare and familiar chaos of the first suburban service station. I waited there until 7 a.m., sleeping fitfully behind my locked, bolted doors. I called a tow truck, explaining the strange blue engine light to the baffled attendant, who thought I was completely out of my mind. The mechanic found nothing wrong, except one strange, final remnant of my terror. The small, interior air filter in the passenger side housing had partially melted. The paper had been intensely seared, baked to a dry, papery char, radiating a sharp, coppery smell and a final, lingering heat that the mechanic, confusingly, said he'd never seen before. It looked exactly like one of the electronic components had been fried by a massive, local EMP surge, an event that should have completely knocked out every modern computer. The check engine light was no longer blue. It was a familiar, rational burnt orange. I quit the sales job and the desperate, late-night driving after that. I sold the Ford for a massive loss, desperate to avoid getting into any sedan, under any circumstances, and finding a stranger staring back at me from the passenger seat a moment later. That man I picked up wasn't on the road. He hadn't broken down. He was a long-dead, long-fried human soul, a phantom of some bizarre, high-intensity electrical event, perhaps in a plane crash or a hidden power accident deep in the desert, that was now simply reappearing at the location of his death, seeking a short, terrified ride, using the cold of the current storm as his vehicle to temporarily breach back into my reality. I will never pick up a soul on the highway again, now knowing that the heavy rain is not the soothing thing that lulls us to sleep. It's the physical oil that allows the forgotten, the burnt, and the desperate to momentarily bleed back into the driving lane. Story 7. They told me the former Valois family funeral parlor in New Orleans was a great gig, easy security work, no people, and good pay for a complete walk-and-lock schedule. The building was old, grand, and centrally located, and was in the process of a full, months-long, gut-to-studs renovation, being converted into high-end executive office space. 2 entire floors were mostly unfinished concrete and exposed lath and plaster, which meant 2 floors were just noisy darkness after 7 p.m. My job was simple: overnight security watch in the trailer, ensuring no one, contractors, vandals, or squatters, was inside the vast, cold space of the former funeral home. I didn't believe in the morbid history, but I knew the palpable, sickening level of dread the building still produced was real. I can't tell you the total number of wakes and final viewings that had occurred there, only that the structure felt intensely saturated by all that quiet devastation. Every piece of dark brick and old cypress would seem to hum with that specific, heavy energy. The first few weeks were mundane. A loose wire, flickering lights in the unfinished construction zone, items I'd sworn I'd left one place turning up exactly 2 feet to the right. Normal renovation chaos that I attributed to the contractors leaving in a panicked last-second rush. But the tension intensified during my 3rd week, particularly during what I called the 2 a.m. midnight tension. At this precise hour, the usual city electrical hum in the rest of New Orleans would disappear, and the generator's distant sound would cease its operation, forcing the entire structure into a deep, oppressive quiet. Then, the rhythmic sounds would commence, a slow, measured, awful creaking sound as the old beams compressed and shifted under pressure. The building seemed to truly breathe in the dark, a slow, sustained respiratory noise I only heard when I was inside the exact center of the ground floor. The area had been the main viewing chapel and service entry point for over a century. Now, it was a long, dark, cavernous space lined with construction debris. My favorite place to avoid was always the service and loading bay door, the one place the new contractors refused to touch, a small, dark back room with a massive industrial elevator at one end and a single, heavy, almost terrifying steel double door set in the middle of a brick archway. This was the door where every single body, dead or embalmed, had been first brought into Valois funeral parlor and finally removed from it. I knew, with a horrible, visceral certainty, that the midnight tension that afflicted the building didn't stop. It simply settled itself right there, waiting between the steel doors for me to walk by it. During my 2 a.m. walkthrough, 2 weeks in, I had my first moment of undiluted terror. The silence was absolute. As I descended from the unfinished third floor, no building breathing today, just dead, cold air, I reached the second-story landing and realized the contractor's enormous, heavy-duty wooden ladder I had left there had been moved. It wasn't tumbled or kicked over. It had been meticulously dragged across the cold, rough concrete in a straight line and was now leaning at a slight, unnatural angle against a distant, exposed brick wall, exactly 90 degrees from where I had left it. It was too heavy for wind or a contractor's sick joke. Recognizing the deliberate, powerful effort it must have taken, I slowly muscled it back into its safe position. My theory that contractors were messing with me was the only defense left to what I had just seen. I continued to the ground floor in a rising state of high anxiety. I reached the steel loading bay door again for my final check. I always did it last. My flashlight beam immediately picked up a glistening trail on the polished, dark red travertine floor. It was a liquid trail, clear, thick, and viscous, running exactly 1 foot out from the massive, dust-sealed seam where the steel doors met the floor, the exact place where I swore the tension always settled. The trail looked like condensation, but with a terrible, oily density, and it smelled distinctly of stale ozone, mixed with something like very old funeral flowers and burnt tallow. The smell seemed to physically push back against the light of my beam. Suddenly, I heard a terrible sound, a sharp snap. Clack! From the small wiring conduit about 5 feet above the double-door archway. The snapping was followed by an instant, complete outage of my flashlight. From a brilliant bulb to dead blackness in an instant, its chemical reaction entirely extinguished. This place was not just dark, it was capable of draining light entirely. Left in the total, physical blackness, all I could perceive in the confines of that ancient funeral home were the horrible smell and the oppressive silence. My adrenaline hummed like a severed wire. I scrambled backwards, one-handed and shaking, out of the room, fumbling my way over unseen construction debris, racing for the external glass doors near the street where a hint of the outside world, a familiar streetlight, promised salvation. I slammed the emergency bar, tore the twin doors open, and stumbled onto the slick concrete of the perimeter, gasping in the blessed cold, drizzling night air. All the stillness I had endured over the last 40 minutes was, in an instant, absolutely rent apart by a new sound, an agonizing, continuous metallic shriek that sounded exactly like the main internal industrial elevator, the kind used only for caskets and massive equipment, was cycling up and down, non-stop, hitting the ceiling and the support anchors with terrifying, continuous, grinding thuds. But an elevator cycling wildly on its own was absolutely impossible. The system had been disconnected, padlocked, and rendered completely inert for months as the crew renovated the top floor. Now, it shrieked like a frantic, confused animal clawing its way up the shaft. I didn't wait to see if the shriek intensified. I simply ran down the alley toward the temporary security post that held my car keys and my company radio. After an incoherent, panicked exchange with my supervisor, who chalked it all up to the noise of the rain and a stressful shift, and after he politely suggested I finish my job, I was alone again. Against my crippled logic, I returned to the main structure. The elevator's shriek was gone. Utter silence had returned, followed quickly by the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the building commencing again, a slow, creaking, cyclical, awful exhale of old air that gently moved the fine construction dust on the floor. I grabbed a small, heavy piece of iron rebar from a discarded pallet, a pathetic excuse for a weapon, but the only defense I had left, and proceeded to the final objective, the basement inspection, where the old boiler room and equipment were supposedly stored. The basement was truly black. A deep, enveloping darkness. I walked the long, dusty row of boiler equipment, my spare flashlight casting huge, dancing shadows, trying to find anything to explain the violent elevator activity. Nothing. Right as I was giving up, I stepped into a particularly bad patch of soft, waterlogged, clay dirt at the back of the machinery. And as my foot sank in slightly, I heard a quiet, almost imperceptible sound, soft, gentle singing. It was a clear, unattached tenor voice, fragile and beautiful. Just a simple hymn, the kind of music they play at the conclusion of a wake for the dearly departed. It was so out of place that it instantly tripled my anxiety, a small piece of clear beauty hidden inside the horrific dark. My flashlight trembled as I held it high, trying to find the source. My beam found a small object, perched precariously and impossibly high on a shelf far above the last boiler. A huge, antique, brown paper, cardboard storage box, the size contractors used for packing drywall. The same package design they used to move the embalming supplies back in the 1960s. And the singing was now clearly coming from inside the box. It sat on the highest shelf. No person, not with that fragile shelving, could have placed that heavy, 50-pound cardboard box up there. It was unnaturally placed. My eyes focused on the top label, yellowed with age, but still perfectly crisp and legible for the final scene. Written in thick, black marker, a final piece of terror waited for my attention. Valwa Funeral Home. Final viewings. Keep closed. My terror was now pure, physical paralysis. The voice inside the box finished its final, high-pitched, gentle note. Then, a single low, rasping sound, like someone taking a long, tearing cloth and slowly dragging it across a dry marble surface, emanated from inside the box itself, immediately followed by the distinct sound of breathing, the same, heavy, familiar, slow exhalation that the entire building made when it was active. The source of the house's sickness had found me, and I was exactly at the spot it had decided to finish whatever service it had been conducting. I threw the iron rebar, turned, and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the airport on the other side of the state. I never saw the morning light inside that terrible building again, and I didn't care what the supervisor said. I knew what I had faced. The ancient funeral home didn't have classic ghosts floating on the ceiling. It contained a profound intelligence, locked in the basement, singing hymns, demanding an audience, and waiting only for the right kind of human isolation and the deep darkness of New Orleans' rainy night to begin its final, terrible service once again. Story 8. I took the job because the pay was insane, essentially triple the rate for any other security post in Detroit. But I quickly learned that the overtime wasn't for dealing with vandals. It was compensation for the psychic damage caused by standing guard over the massive, 100-year-old ironclad foundry near the waterfront. The place was a monument to industrial death. It was completely shuttered, legally condemned, and powered down to the main internal grid connection. The building itself was an immense, echoing shell of brick, rusted iron gantries, and cold concrete, permeated by the thick, distinct smell of stale iron oxide and old river water. My post was a small, prefab steel hut in the maintenance yard near an isolated secondary building. The main structure didn't even have doors large enough for human entry anymore, only massive, reinforced rolling gates from the 1920s. Nobody was getting in, and even the sounds from the distant city were swallowed by the sheer mass of the defunct factory. I worked 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 7 nights a week, with only the persistent, heavy rain of the long Michiganan fall for company. The first few weeks were silent, cold, and easy. I read paperbacks and listened to podcasts. But the boredom ended on my third Tuesday on site, shortly after midnight. I was outside my hut, checking my perimeter patrol, scanning the rain-slicked wall of the main foundry, when I heard it. A sound, a distinct, rhythmic clack-chunk. It was a sound of immense industry, the methodical, heavy operation of the secondary gantry crane, the machine that would lift and traverse a 6-ton ladle of molten metal from the main furnace to the forming molds at the far end of the plant. The sound was unnerving because it came from inside the factory, which was dead, and it came from a machine that had been completely deactivated and locked down a decade prior, with all its power grids dismantled. I froze against the heavy downpour that was now rushing over me, my flashlight beam shaking uncontrollably. The gantry crane was massive, heavy, and silent even when active. If it was moving, it meant a major issue, either catastrophic structural failure or highly coordinated professional trespass. I immediately radioed my supervisor. "Security to control, I'm getting internal ambient noise from the main building on Sector 3. Sounds like heavy machinery initiating operation." His reply was instantaneous, a crackle of static and rain. "Negative, security. All internal systems are dead. The perimeter sensors around that section read nothing but natural environment. You are fully sealed. Check your sensors for radio bleed and remain in your zone." I knew I hadn't imagined it. The noise continued inside, clack-a-chunk, followed by a low, consistent, massive hum that sounded exactly like the main smelting fan slowly beginning its rotation. The sound was incredibly loud, and it persisted for almost 30 minutes before fading back into the oppressive silence of the rain and my own breathing. I wrote it down on my clipboard as an unidentified metallic noise, the code for noise I cannot explain but absolutely heard and am not going to investigate. The sound became routine. Every night, sometimes at 1:30 a.m., sometimes at 3:15 a.m., the heavy sound of the dormant machines inside the abandoned foundry would commence. And every night, a slight modification to the noise would occur. It went from the sound of the main crane to the loud, grinding churn of the immense ore sifters, then to the rhythmic, constant clang-clang-clang of the heavy iron stamping arms punching material into place. The entire inner factory, though dead, was operating on a full production cycle for up to 2 hours every night. I began sticking my head to the cold exterior brick wall, trying to determine the pattern. What I noticed, and what sent the cold dread into my heart, was not the sound, but its implication. The internal cycle was never random. It was a precise, full, 8-hour operation cycle condensed into 1 hour of heavy auditory terror. The machinery of the dead company was now running off a strange, localized, non-electrical power source, forced to replay its entire day of industrial servitude after midnight. My breaking point came in the middle of a torrential downpour, several weeks in. I was alone, sitting inside my steel hut. It was 3 a.m., and the main foundry had been in its most active, horrific phase all night. The sound was now centered entirely on the old, main foreman's watch office, a rickety piece of ancient wooden office architecture built directly into the side of the towering main furnace. The noise had become high-pitched, frenetic, desperate, the sound of a small, human voice, a man's shouting, attempting to give commands, trying to override the crushing, deafening grind of the machines as they were forced to operate on this hidden schedule. Suddenly, the voice and the machinery stopped synchronously. Only silence remained, filled only by the thick, rushing sound of the relentless rain. I thought the phenomenon was finally over. But then, a high, strained, and intensely loud static hum came out of the 2-inch gap between the bottom of the main steel rolling gate and the rain-slicked concrete floor. The hum intensified rapidly, coalescing into a single, high-pitched whine that hurt my teeth and dried the moisture instantly from the air. The sound carried with it a singular message, voiced by a high, stretched, agonizing electronic drone that was clearly intelligent. "We have to make today happen again. The demand is constant. We cannot stop. Where is the metal, Frank? Where is the metal?" The voice, the machine's agonizing, tortured intelligence, amplified by residual power within the shut machinery, was now searching for its raw material. And it knew my name, Frank. Not my real name, but the name on the company work vest belonging to the tired construction worker who had last taken my shift 2 hours prior. The voice was asking for Frank, the one who should have brought the fresh steel. And that's when I heard the horrifying, real-world consequence. Over the high, painful drone, another sound, much quieter, emanated from the dense, Blackness 15 feet to the left of my steel hut. The familiar, heavy, drag of a 60-pound metal chain, once again moving slowly over cold, rain-slick stone, being positioned to re-enter the main building. The sound intensified at a horrifying rate, moving from slow scraping to a quick, almost panicked clatter-drag rushing to get to the main door. I grabbed the heavy crowbar I kept for self-defense, locked my eyes shut to break the visual terror, and scrambled out, not even daring to call the supervisor. I ran in the deluge, through the rain, and did not stop until I saw the bright, beautiful, artificial glare of a 24-hour fluorescent diner sign at the nearest freeway junction. I didn't look back. I knew that the midnight shift at the foundry wasn't a paranormal event, but a deep, permanent curse. The ghosts that haunted the Detroit factory weren't the long-dead manual laborers. They were the machines themselves, which had been so deeply imbued with the energy of the mandated, grueling workflow that they could not power down, continuing to run an agonizing ghost shift of perpetual industrial servitude off the sheer mental energy of the living. And tonight, with the voice calling my name, they needed me to continue the awful, never-ending day. My only saving grace was that my real name wasn't Frank. But the simple, terrifying call to work again, that was its universal message. Story 9. I took the job as an ICU nurse's assistant at the city psychiatric hospital, a massive, imposing, stone behemoth of a building in upstate New York, founded in the 1890s. The unit I was assigned to, Wing D, was the absolute pit of the complex. It was permanently decommissioned 15 years ago during a funding crunch, now used only for administrative storage and occasional supply transit. It was supposed to be completely dead space. However, my supervisor, a weary man named George, insisted that the 2-hour shift for security checks in Wing D was non-negotiable every night after 2 a.m., especially during the relentless rain and high winds of the late autumn season which always shook the old stone structure. I should have paid attention to George's unnerving tension, but the hospital's pay was far too generous for me to question the protocol. Wing D itself was a sensory nightmare. The floors were thick, dusty parquet tile, the air smelled perpetually of dried chemicals and unclean decay, and the long hallways were lined with patient rooms, all of them locked, all of them completely empty, their doors marked with simple, large, printed numerical signifiers, D4, D5, D6, in a terrifying progression. The entire 200-yard wing was lit only by sporadic, ancient incandescent bulbs that gave off a sickly, orange-yellow light that made everything blurry and too dim. The protocol for our security check wasn't complex. Walk the length of the wing, ensure all 10 patient doors remained secured, double-check that the large, thick mainline ventilation grill to the main hospital was locked down, and get out. The issue began on my 5th night. The rain outside was relentless, a drumming roar of water and sleet against the high, tiny windows that threw dancing, impossible shadows over the patient doors. As I did my first check stop, moving silently past room D6, the room at the center of the arc, I heard an immediate, soft sound behind the locked, thick oak door, a quick, frantic rattle. Nothing loud, maybe a key being quickly jangled or a heavy pill bottle being rapidly shaken. It was clearly non-organic and man-made. I froze. I checked the locking mechanism. Heavy chrome lever bolts, set and cold. The door was sealed. Rats, a broken vent, high wind vibration, I forced into my mind, clinging to rational thought. I continued to D7, D8, and D9 until I reached the sealed ventilation shaft at the end of the long hall. Check complete. I turned and started my slow retreat down the long, light-devouring pathway back to the main hospital structure. As I passed D4, the first door on the right side on my way out, the subtle sound happened again. But this time it was different, too physical for rats. It was the distinct sound of a very small, very dry hand, a child's hand maybe, making a quick, short scrape as it was briefly removed from an old, rusted metal filing cabinet surface. It sounded like fingernails quickly catching the metal. I stopped immediately, facing D4. The scraping was coming from inside. The patient door, thick oak with a small, circular wire mesh eye hole in the center, remained stubbornly sealed shut. My hand felt cold sweat on the chrome inspection bolt. This is impossible. The record state D4 was last used. I checked my watch. 2:42 a.m. The hour of the non-living. I decided to stop ignoring the auditory terror. I put my eye directly up to the small wire mesh viewer in the center of the D4 door. My flashlight was useless. The mesh absorbed all the light. Inside, absolute blackness. Nothing but the suffocating depth of the thick, heavy institutional dark. Staring into the deep shadow felt like staring down into the perfect well of human decay. I lingered only for 3 long, agonizing seconds and pulled back, shaken by the overwhelming physical sense of utter, absolute isolation that met my inspection. I did not see a thing. As I stepped back, I realized the terror was changing shape. The air around the patient doors had changed. The atmosphere around D4, D5, and D6 felt electrically charged, almost hot like the heat of internal fever emanating from the thick oak boards. Driven by a morbid need to understand the source, I walked slowly forward to D6 one last time, my mind frantically looking for excuses, faulty pipes, wind-related compression in the vents, anything but a physical, sentient presence in the room. As I reached D6, my panic solidified into absolute, stunning horror. The door's heavy, rusted chrome locking mechanism that had been secured was visibly bent. Not broken, but slightly deformed. The thick, forged steel was subtly warped at the top, pulled upward, as if something from the inside had been placing continuous, rhythmic upward weight upon the single, central locking bolt until the sheer pressure bent the reinforced steel plate. The metallic deformity reeked immediately of high friction, and a terrible hot, coppery smell wafted off the bend into the cold, surgical air. The physical pressure wasn't intended to open the door. It was just a sustained, deliberate application of insane internal force, confirming the absolute terror now contained and sealed off in the single space. I ran. Not in a panicked sprint, but an organized, fast flight, covering the entire remaining length of the hall without stopping, ignoring my watch, ignoring the sudden sound of a single, slow, rhythmic thump-thump coming from the end of the terrifying hall. I slammed the final security door behind me, sealing Wing D completely, and ran to the administrator's security room. There, in the blessed, functional light of the 21st century, I pulled the century-old paper records for Wing D, frantically checking the rooms I had passed. I checked the record of abandonment and decommissioning. Room D9 had been the last room in Wing D. Past D9, no rooms should have been listed. Yet, the old paper floor plan clearly showed an entirely hidden, final room, completely unlisted in any modern database. The door was disguised and set deep into the granite wall. The room number, visible only on the old diagram, was D10. The patient for D10 had no name, only 2 words in the space for diagnosis. Unconfined fear. The door to this empty, final room was never meant to be inspected. Its steel door was sealed with concrete after funding was cut off in 1999. The old paper record said the patient was simply left there. I realized D4, D5, D6, and D9 weren't the real problem. They were merely physical space separators that had been used by something far more terrible. Every evening, from 2 a.m., the force that was trapped, or willingly living, inside the hidden final room D10 would begin the laborious, physical process of testing the integrity of the separating walls between the rooms, searching for the path back out into the open world by the only method it still had: sheer, organized, insane pressure against the confining structure. The unnamed patient wasn't trying to escape. He was using the immense force of psychokinetic power to systematically damage the wall and make contact again with the reality of living people. I quit that shift and refused to step foot in that part of the complex again. Now, when I hear the rain hammer against the outside of the building, my gut instantly tightens. It's not the sound of nature. All I can hear is the profound, sustained pressure of an invisible force being continuously, patiently, terribly applied against the strongest structural defense I have. That patient's final hour will never end. Story 10. Lake Huron in northern Michigan is not really a lake. It's an inland sea, vast, indifferent, and during a severe storm, utterly terrifying. I was far north of the population centers, camping alone on a small, overgrown peninsula a few seasons ago, testing gear for a major distributor. The isolation was immediate and profound. The whole area was nothing but thick stands of dying pine, massive slabs of cold, wave-battered granite, and dense fog rolling off the cold water. My tent was set up close to the shore, giving me a perfect, terrifying view of the black, turbulent water only 20 feet from my sleeping bag. The problem was, I was the only thing moving for miles in every direction. At 1 a.m., the massive storm hit with sudden finality, sheets of freezing rain driven by high, erratic winds that screamed over the high bluffs, mixing with the powerful sound of the waves pounding the granite breakwater. The sound of the combined wind and water was a near physical assault on my flimsy tent structure. I was settling in when I heard the sound that confirmed I didn't want to be there. A voice, low and sustained, coming from across the churning water. It was clearly identifiable as human, male, and intensely sad, a slow, drawn-out cry of a single, long syllable. Will. It didn't sound like my name, but a mournful, drawn-out plea I immediately associated with the sound of someone desperately calling for a loved one. The wind made the source almost impossible to pinpoint, but logic dictated I must have been hearing a struggling boat, likely a confused local out on the lake. They sound like they're in trouble. Really bad trouble. I grabbed my thick parka, zipped it up, and tore open the main entry flap of the tent. I stuck my head out into the violent, cold air, sweeping my strong beam flashlight across the immediate chaos of the turbulent lake's surface. The massive white spray of the violent, wind-whipped waves obliterated all visibility 30 feet out. Nothing. Not a boat light, not an aluminum hull, not even the faint sound of a dying outboard engine. Only the high, terrible shriek of the wind and the deafening rush of the water on the shore. I dismissed it. Wind must have carried the sound from miles out, the echo of another fisherman. I pulled my head back inside the relative warmth of the tent, zipped the flap shut, and poured a warm coffee from the canteen, focusing on the domestic safety of my small, isolated space. Then, the calling started again. But this time, I could discern more sound and more language. The voice, the low, sad moan, had changed location. Now, it was directly in front of my tent entry, only separated from my fear by the 2 feet of thick, cold, wet canvas. The wind itself seemed to bend around the source. It was clearly the same man, speaking in an exhausted, wet gasp that sounded like he'd been fully submerged just moments before. Will. I lost balance. The net is heavy. The rope is short. Every word was pulled out with physical difficulty, a long, agonizing delay between one syllable and the next due to the sheer absence of breath or air. The terrifying thing was the intimacy. The voice was talking with the same low, desperate tone a man uses when he is whispering his final information just before he lets go. It had followed my movement and set the source of its terror directly on my safe zone. I unzipped my tent flap a crack, pointing the heavy-duty flashlight out into the swirling darkness. The beam cut through the wind and spray, but only illuminated the large, empty granite slab immediately in front of my perimeter. Nothing. No shape, no man, no dripping clothes, no footprints on the cold, hard rock surface. But the voice was still there, a sound with no physical body attached. Now, the terror had shifted from panic to absolute, frozen dread. The voice was reciting not the actions of a living person, but the terrible, specific, drawn-out mechanical steps involved in drowning. The water is cold, so very cold. I am forgetting how to move the hands. Will, look at my hands, don't leave me. I zipped the tent shut again, my mind frantically cycling through facts. This entity, the voice, was attached to me. It wanted my attention. It wanted a witness to some physical event that had transpired exactly on this spot 30 feet from the tent boundary. The key was in the intimacy of the language. Lost balance, cold water, net is heavy. It was the phantom echo of a fisherman's fate, someone who had sunk to the endless, black depth of the enormous inland sea right here. I frantically fumbled in the interior pocket of my pack, pulling out the largest, dirtiest item I owned, a heavy tarpaulin, an attempt to throw a solid visual barrier between me and the sound. I quickly jammed the heavy-duty canvassing against the tent flap, attempting to physically mask the window that the sound was using. The instant the canvassing material made contact with the zipper line, the voice outside changed violently. The strained, sad gasping immediately stopped and was replaced by a short, terrible burst of uncontrolled rage. The voice screamed, not human in its volume, but unholy in its pure fury. "No! You will watch the end, damn you!" The scream was immediately followed by a terrifying, prolonged explosion of high-decibel sound, the sickening, loud scrape rustle of something enormous, hundreds of pounds of submerged, waterlogged, tangled fishing net, being suddenly dragged with impossible, tremendous physical labor against the rough, high-density granite of the breakwater 20 feet from my tent's location, the sound of metal mesh against the dry rock utterly deafening in the isolated horror of the storm. The sound intensified rapidly, a rhythmic drag and scrape getting terrifyingly close to the tent fabric. The physical action now was direct and purposeful. Something was pulling itself physically over the breakwater, forcing its escape from the perpetual depth just to reach the single witness who had dared to listen to the death in the dark. I scrambled back under my sleeping bag, shaking violently, hiding my face against the internal cotton stuffing. My eyes were shut tight, refusing to look at the silhouette a large, wet entity would cast on the tent's fabric. The violent, metallic scraping continued, growing horribly close. I could hear the physical vibration through the cold, wet ground beneath my body, each forward yard an existential victory for the thing outside. The movement stopped just inches from the tent floor, replaced by a wet, bubbling, deep panting sound that radiated an intense, focused, icy chill that sliced straight through the 3 layers of my clothes. The creature was there, breathing, waiting, completely outside and over me. And then, there was only the final, simple sound, a soft, drawn-out, wet tap on the tent's roof, right above head, a slow, gentle touch accompanied by a low, desperate whisper I only barely perceived. "I need you to remember, Will." I didn't open my eyes. I didn't utter a sound. I lay paralyzed until the cold, beautiful Michigan sunrise finally cut through the heavy, wet fog, a sound of natural hope filling the void of the dying supernatural energy. The calling instantly ceased. The panting and the horrific stillness immediately dissipated. When I finally found the courage to open the zipper, the area was empty. Only the dense, still, wet granite and the high spray of the waves remained. I packed the tent in under 5 minutes, destroying the tent fabric where the tapping had occurred. The terrible truth was obvious. That fisherman, who had drowned and sunk here decades ago, was only seeking release from the immense pressure and cold by forcing people to remember his demise. And tonight, my terrified attention had almost succeeded in saving him. If only I had looked and succumbed to his plea. I'll never fish an inland sea again. A massive lake during a storm is not a natural beauty. It's just the perfect acoustic medium through which the absolute suffering of the drowning dead can transmit its pleas to the living. Story 11. The old farmhouse, 60 miles outside of Austin, Texas, was a rental scam run by a distant land management firm that never bothered to inspect its own properties. The front was beautiful, a massive, 2-story Gothic clapboard structure, wrapped in old cypress, and set amongst endless, terrifyingly dark rows of dry corn. I had rented it for a year, a young college kid desperate for solitude and enough cheap space to write my last 2 history papers. The problem wasn't the house overhead, it was what I kept hearing underneath. The low, vibrating echoes of what sounded like an organized, secret ritual directly beneath my living room. Specifically, beneath an old, dusty, unpainted root cellar door set into the floor of the utility closet. The unsettling quiet started my descent. On a clear, early fall night, I noticed that the entire first floor of the house was vibrating, a slow, sustained internal shiver that had nothing to do with the heavy wind and rain that often swept across the flat farmlands. It was a subsonic noise, deep, rhythmic, percussive, and utterly unnatural in the cold, dry air. It wasn't the washing machine. It was coming straight from the floor. I immediately traced the noise back to the utility closet and the old root cellar access, a trapdoor with 2 large, heavy, corroded internal hinges, and a rusted metal pull ring set into the rotting wood. I knew immediately, with chilling certainty, that the rhythmic noise didn't belong to the building, but was an amplified signal from the soil below, passed precisely through the old wooden covering. My logical deduction was that I had a massive infestation of nutria or some kind of tunneling groundhog tearing up the old foundation. A nuisance. I found a heavy flashlight, and gripping the cold piece of metal, I took one look at the rusted, heavy pull ring on the trapdoor and decided I'd buy some exterminator traps in the morning light. I just had to survive the low, internal trembling until then. I sat in a heavy, old lounge chair near the closet, nervously listening and waiting for the sound to fade out. That's when I finally separated the full composite noise into its two primary components: the deep rhythmic percussion, which sounded like a heavy, dense book being slammed on a rock over and over in perfect cadence, and the secondary, much more terrible component, a unified choir of low volume, human chanting. Not humming, but definite, sustained, rhythmic, and incredibly low-pitched. It was the synchronized male voice of a crowd, a thick, throbbing chorus of sound that instantly eliminated all possibility of burrowing animals. I called the landlords, trying to report unauthorized human noise in the cellar. The phone cut off as soon as the line connected, replaced by a sudden rush of white static and a very loud, synthesized, distorted vocal recording of my own frantic breath from last week. I recognized the terror immediately from my friend's story. The whisper filter had found my location. My security was instantly and entirely compromised. I was alone, 200 miles from a population center, and stuck over a basement filled with a human ritual. Paranoia drove my actions. They knew I was listening. The voices underneath intensified, and the percussion moved to a faster, more agitated rhythm. Whatever they were doing, it required extreme concentration, and my listening presence was a massive, growing distraction that would eventually be solved. I found a piece of 2x4 in a pile of logs by the fireplace and silently jammed it under the pull ring of the root cellar door as a crude latch, hoping the flimsy resistance would somehow stop the upward motion. Then I retreated to the top of the stairs, pointing my shotgun, something I'd owned for years and never used, down the hallway. The movement came not from the cellar but from my main front window. In the deepest, blackest silence that fell over the house as the chanting momentarily stopped, I saw the thick silhouette of a man moving past the window, very tall, intensely dark, draped in a kind of heavy, loose material that trailed behind him. He was standing on the lawn just outside the glass, facing the front of my rental house. He then stopped, facing my exact location, and slowly raised a large, pale object that reflected the diffused streetlight glow. It was a single, ancient, dry deer skull, large, black-eyed, and completely hollow, that he deliberately tilted until the empty socket of the right eye was facing me. And from the empty cavity of that dried bone, a new, single, dry, and distinctly female voice clearly drifted across the air and into the house, completely replacing the heavy silence I had just experienced. The voice didn't speak a complete sentence, only a single, long, drawn-out word that instantly paralyzed me. H. Y. D. E. The dry, high-pitched syllable was the exact, simple spelling of my first name. The figure held the terrifying skull there for maybe 30 seconds, a visual confirmation of the terror beneath and the horror outside. Then, he simply turned and disappeared back into the thick anonymity of the moonless, wet prairie night. No running, no fast motion, just gone. The sudden appearance and quick retreat made the whole scenario profoundly more frightening. This creature, this cult below the farmhouse member, was just checking my status, marking the door, and then retreating to ensure the basement right continued uninterrupted. Now released from the freezing fear I had just experienced, I did the most irrational, desperate act I could imagine. I knew exactly what they were chanting for in that cold, silent soil 200 miles from Austin. They were enacting a ritual of possessive escape. I grabbed a can of thick black asphalt paint, ran to the closet access hatch, yanked out the crude 2x4 lock, and began painting the entire exposed surface of the basement door. I didn't paint a symbol or a hex. I only painted a single, massive, perfect, blinding white cross-section across the wood grain, a physical effort to draw in as much of the available outside light as possible and focus it onto a single, small surface, a desperate attempt to deny the basement cult the covering of darkness it was feeding off. I waited 5 continuous minutes. The chant below stopped dead in the middle of a syllable. The subsonic trembling of the house abruptly ceased. In its place, I heard a sound from directly beneath the painted wood, a deep, profound, continuous hiss. A massive, audible release of thick, angry air and raw sound escaping from between the floorboards, an instant, painful exposure of a thick, hot substance reacting chemically to an external, light-infused pollutant. The entire basement, every dark corner, was screaming from one simple physical act. Then, the sound subsided into a low, quiet, sustained gurgle that continued all night until I left. I escaped from the house at first light, leaving every door open to the returning sun and the wind, dropping my possessions, my scholarship papers, and all my work. I never confirmed the contents of the cellar. The simple door had become a terrifying, magical barrier. But I knew the final answer. The cult below the farmhouse weren't practicing local voodoo. They were performing an elaborate, agonizing ritual of demonic invitation to transfer something from permanent solitude deep underground into the nearest physical human vessel. My only act, painting the door white, had been the crude equivalent of splashing holy water onto their darkest work. The darkness retreated, but the profound fear remains. Because I know that when I next go to the country, and the full, beautiful, persistent light of the sun hits a certain patch of cold, cracked earth, that low, rhythmic, furious chanting will begin again, closer and faster, waiting only for my ear on the floor to initiate the final ascent. Story 12. I took the graveyard shift because of the rain. Working as a final call janitor at an ancient, small-town high school in rural western Alabama meant total isolation, deep silence, and the continuous drumming of the heavy southeastern storms on the asphalt roof. Perfect white noise for studying for my community college exams. The school was a sprawling 1950s relic, all long, echoing hallways, low-slung ceiling tiles, and dense, dark shadows that seemed to pool in the corners no matter how bright the overhead fluorescents were. My closing shift, running from 11 p.m. to 4 a.m., had one central task after the vacuuming and floor treatment were done: securing the main wings. The whole place had to be locked down. Every single door, all 53 of them, had to be bolted, barred, and sealed. This one simple, mechanical task soon became the physical focus of an impossible and relentless poltergeist. The routine was automatic. I would walk the long, quiet hallways of the academic wing, using the master key to twist the ancient deadbolts. Click, clack, secured. My first 10 minutes were devoted to this rhythmic process, leaving a perfectly battened down hallway behind me, ready for my final walk and immediate freedom. The problem started on my 5th night. I had just finished the last door on the administrative entrance, door number twice locked 12, as I called it for its particularly sticky lock, and I was about to turn the corner when a quiet but definite clack-click came from behind me. The unmistakable sound of a heavy steel internal bolt being slowly and entirely drawn back from twice locked 12. I froze back to the wall, instantly drenched in cold dread. A small, human-sized portion of my neatly locked security perimeter had just been reversed. I spun around to face the silent white door. It looked untouched, static, and locked. I crept up to it, checked the heavy master deadbolt again. It was, impossibly, set on fully locked status. It must have been the final, subtle shift of the heavy brass tumblers releasing a strange piece of internal friction noise, I reasoned, desperate for any logical explanation. But the sense that I was being physically targeted, that a direct, deliberate counter-move to my work had just happened, sent a deep, absolute shiver up my spine. I left it, moving to the gym and cafeteria wings, completing the 40 other doors in the same rigid process. When I finished, the silence in the hallways was deafening, the rain on the roof the only comforting constant. I hurried back to the central office to finish logging my shift. But as I reached the main staircase, the same sound returned. 5 distinct, repetitive clack clicks over 60 seconds, originating from the entire stretch of hallway I had just systematically sealed. The sound was too clear, too specific, too sustained to be a structural warp. It was the sound of heavy metal slipping backward, simultaneously, 5 mechanisms being slowly but firmly undone. This wasn't chaos. It was an organized, dedicated attempt to leave the building open to the outside. My entire job, the sole responsibility of my shift, was being physically fought every night. It was the absolute horror of the lockup code. I broke protocol and returned to the hallway. I didn't grab anything to defend myself. I grabbed my camera phone. The terror had changed me. I no longer needed to uncover the terror. I needed to log it. I walked to door number D38, the single French door entrance where one lock, I swore, had felt particularly solid. And as I reached it, I did something desperate. I turned the lock counterclockwise for one full turn, securing it manually, firmly, and entirely in the heavy, closed position. I stepped back 4 feet, flashlight on, waiting for the instantaneous, inevitable counter-move. All I heard was one final, terrible wind-up sound, a sound unlike human muscle, a low, rhythmic, internal crank, coming from deep inside the brass housing of D38's lock mechanism. It spun for 4 loud, unnatural, rhythmic seconds and ceased. I immediately ran to the door. I threw my weight on the handle. Completely, heavily, and with a shocking feeling of finality, it was locked. Finally, a small victory. I turned, preparing to leave. But, as I walked away, one quiet, simple thing happened. I watched the steel doorknob of D38, still in the light of my sweeping beam, slowly, visibly, turn clockwise. It rotated with unnerving pressure, the full, obvious, controlled effort of an unseen hand pressing on its interior surface. And gently, quietly, the bolt of the internal mechanism was dragged back and fully unlocked. There was barely any friction sound. The internal poltergeist was not strong but controlled, methodical, and profoundly patient. It hadn't pried D38. It had mastered the process of locking and unlocked the bolt with absolute stillness and precision. I ran back to the room, opened the door, and peered inside. A quiet, static, empty math classroom bathed in the single, sickly light from the fire exit sign. No human explanation could account for the full turn and reverse process of the lock. I retreated. I didn't dare relock it. The inevitable counter-move was now a guarantee. But the most terrifying part of that night came later. I was sitting at the administration desk, writing my resignation letter, my flashlight beam cutting through the rain streaked hall. It was 4:03 a.m. My shift had ended. Suddenly, a short, rapid, sustained rap came from my immediate right, near the desk's heavy, built-in drawer units. Not 2 or 4, but 3 persistent, demanding rings. I flinched, but refused to move or look down. I knew the entity was here, finally trying to deliver a warning or a message. The tapping finished and was replaced by a familiar sound, the quiet, low, rattling cough, the final sound from my former supervisor, George, who had insisted on the 2 a.m. check-in, and recently died off-duty from a severe, long-term heart seizure. The cough was followed immediately by a single, soft, human voice, sounding directly from the closed desk drawer only 2 feet away. "Go home, son. Leave it alone. What's done is done. You don't need to lock the dead in." The voice faded instantly, replaced by the silence and the monotonous drumming of the incessant rain that washed the exterior. The fear wasn't about the unlocking anymore. It was the specific revelation of the purpose behind the noise. The sound was not an aggressive poltergeist. It was the entire legion of lost, long-dead janitors and night watchmen of the long, endless shift, being eternally locked in because of the lockup code. My job, and George's final, terrified duty, was to find the courage to keep locking the doors until the sun made the job irrelevant. My lack of courage had simply unlocked the entire terrifying school population again. My only moment of peace came when I realized I was safe now. I was already entirely consumed by the knowledge that all doors opened again the instant I was not looking. Story 13. I hate coastal fog more than the fog itself. I'm a structural acoustics engineer, and a lot of my contract work involves the repair and maintenance of massive, forgotten infrastructure, oil rigs, bridges, and most importantly fog bells. The sheer intensity of the weather around old installations demands the highest level of concentration. My terrifying job was 3 years ago, a contract repair on the decommissioned old bell system near the Long Island Sound in Connecticut. A massive, ancient bronze apparatus anchored to a small, isolated granite outcropping a full mile off the coast. The atmosphere was immediate dread. The small, gray granite island we were stationed on was always cold, always wet, and always shrouded in a thick, pea-soup fog that made the entire world outside the perimeter light disappear entirely. The fog bell itself was imposing, a monolithic, 300-pound slab of oxidized metal housed in a crumbling 1880s copper shed, built to withstand a century of battering. When in use, a piston unit pushed a massive iron clapper against the chime, producing a deep, resonating boom that defined a marine atmosphere for miles. It had been professionally silent and decommissioned for decades. My job, and that of my one temporary assistant, was simply to reinforce the housing and check the structural integrity for a modern sensor installation. My crew left me on the island for 3 consecutive nights, isolated by poor weather and the erratic ferry schedule. I was alone in my temporary, unheated tent, surrounded by the constant drip of condensation and the high, whining wind that sliced across the small landmass. The core of the old bronze bell, massive, solid, and immovable by hand, was sitting only 50 yards from my small tent door, draped under a cheap blue tarpaulin. The first night passed as normal, the sounds of the storm, the grinding of the shifting bedrock underneath me, nothing out of place. But on the second night, one sound defied all logic. It was not a grand, booming mechanical call, but an immediate, low, and distinct human moan. Not loud, but a soft, protracted vowel sound of absolute, endless misery, coming from right outside the opening flap of my tent. It sounded like an elderly person, absolutely lost to despair, crying out softly for a single word. Time! The moan had a distinct, thick quality to it, the sound amplified and distorted oddly, as if it was being forced through dense, cold, wet bronze. I immediately knew the source. I had left the ancient fog bell completely uncovered. Its immense, hollow structure now served as a massive acoustic microphone and amplifier for the single sound source beneath its own curve. Something under the bell was moaning, and the bronze housing was giving it voice. I threw off the wet canvas blankets and scrambled to the front flap, unzipping it only an inch. My high-power headlamp shone out into the oppressive, thick fog. Nothing. Only the 200 pounds of immense bronze sitting silently under a thick sheet, a shape vaguely resembling a deeply hunched-over figure in the vapor. The moaning continued, a hypnotic, despairing call for time. The sound was non-threatening, just profoundly sad and isolating, the perfect emotion for the cold, empty, miserable island. I immediately packed my bag, found an excuse, and radioed the remote ferry station, trying to explain the acoustic anomaly created by an atmospheric disturbance, and the acute terror the moan that seemed to move directly toward my position was causing. The dispatcher simply assured me it was merely a wind echo mixing with cold water in the turbine of the nearby turbine light, and that the ferry was delayed an additional 8 hours. I was stuck. I armed myself with a heavy piece of titanium pipe and forced myself next to the sound source, directly to the brass bell. Now right beside the copper-stained metal, the sound was louder, denser, more immediate, and now deeply, truly terrifying. The single, drawn-out moan was joined by a sound I only faintly perceived before, a wet, rapid, short, rhythmic, scratching drag. 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 The two separate moans now formed a horrible, high-intensity chorus. The sustained agony of the single, male, low voice begging for time, coupled with a higher-pitched, frantic, fast, and wet sound. It was the absolute sound of someone desperately trying to claw metal from metal. The feeling of absolute terror broke my silence. I started screaming at the enormous piece of metal. "Get out of the bell! What are you doing in the housing? Who is that?" The sound stopped suddenly, completely replaced by a dense, agonizing, overwhelming silence that was heavier and colder than the fog itself. And then, a single, new sound emanated from the hollow, cold bronze housing of the massive bell, a single, short, precise bong. But it was not the industrial, low crash of a machine. It was a clear, perfect resonance, produced by the specific velocity and size of the single, heavy iron clapper hitting the side of the dense brass, the high, full note 100 years of perfect industry had demanded. The sound then decayed perfectly, disappearing into the fog. But before the final high note terminated, another voice, clear, perfect, and terrifying, not begging, but commanding, sounded in the immediate silence. "They are all my time now, not yours." The voice was rough, low, and completely masculine, carrying a chilling certainty that made the simple statement of ownership pure, absolute dread. I stumbled back immediately, dropping my titanium pipe and racing as far away from the massive bronze chime as the small island would allow, leaving the source to make its terrible, booming noise in the persistent, cold, terrifying rhythm of the eternal storm. That night, the loud, precise clang bong of the fully functional fog bell repeated its absolute warning in a perfect rhythm, 3 seconds apart, for the entire duration of my 8-hour detention on the cursed island. The bell was working again, self-pounding, telling all mariners not to approach this cold, wet, terrifyingly alive part of the sea. I quit the job the next day and never returned to the coast. It was never about the structural integrity. The local history of the fog bell's calling confirmed the source. A century ago, the last keeper, a man obsessed with time after the tragic loss of his only son, had been found dead, not from a nautical accident, but simply found smashed and violently crushed to deep red slush deep under the heavy bronze of the chime, after somehow trying to stop its final, constant, awful production of sound. The bell didn't have a ghost. It was actively occupied by a screaming, possessed consciousness who had killed the keeper and only allowed sound to be made when it wanted its horrific command-given voice. My final terror came 2 years later, when the Coast Guard finally towed the wreck under the sound of a completely modern alarm. The massive, beautiful antique bronze chime they retrieved was severely, impossibly scratched by a repeating pattern of small fingernail-sized rips directly along its inner, lower lip, where the sound had been amplified and its message had finally begun.